Absolutely. Good morning. Thanks, Brenda, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. And in addition to Brenda, our roundtable colleagues, Joanna Anderson, Tom Tomberlin, are also on the call, and I might have missed a few others. So obviously, this is not just my work. It's a big group that started it, and an even bigger group that is working on it now with many of you guys who are on the call. So I'm going to kick off with some basic information, but I welcome anyone who either was on the roundtable or is working on the Pepsi subcommittees that's moving this work forward to chime in and make this as much of a discussion as it is a presentation. So, but again, as Brenda said, I'm Geoff Coltrane, Senior Education Advisor to Governor Cooper. I think I know many of you, but not all of you, but it's great to see you all. And thanks for being here on the Friday of a long weekend. Hopefully this is not the only thing standing between you and a long weekend, but glad you're here with us. You can move on to the next slide, Leah. So the Human Capital Roundtable was an informal group that was convened by the Southern Regional Education Board. I guess it's been about 3 years ago now, and really started as a chance for some key folks who were engaged in teacher licensure and teacher preparation issues at the time to have some thoughtful discussions with each other, sort of behind closed doors, if you will, around how to keep the work moving forward. And the two main issues that were sort of driving the conversation at that time, which might seem a bit quaint now given where we are, was some of the challenges around issues with our current licensure system. So at that time, there were issues with passage rates of the new math praxis exam and the foundations of reading, and some of the changes that had been happening. If you remember that there had been enacted, and I think it's still in effect, the legislation that allowed individuals who had not passed the praxis in math to take up to 2 years to pass it. And there was a concern that there were still some teachers that had not passed it yet. What was that going to mean for their ability to get fully licensed? So that was a challenge that we were facing at that time. And then the other was the implementation of Senate Bill 599, which had the accountability system for EPPs in it. So those were two issues that were really sort of driving the conversation early on. And this group, which you can go on to the next slide, Leah, so we can see who was on the roundtable, really came together to sort of have some informal colleague to colleague kind of conversations around those issues, to be thought partners about how can we help to advance that work and be supportive of the work going forward. Well, as those conversations continued, the group started thinking about, well, both the licensure issue that we were wrestling with at the time and a few others that had popped up and some other things really were Band-Aid fixes to a system that we really needed to rethink if we're going to be innovative and really help to strengthen the educator workforce more thoroughly. And so we started talking about what would be an ideal licensure system, and I'll use that term loosely because it's much bigger than that. But what would be an ideal system that we could work towards, and what would be some goals that we'd want to see? So at that point, the roundtable started thinking about, what are some of the challenges we're facing, and then how could we really think out of the box and come up with a system that might be, innovative, but also help to lead to the results that we want to see. And so, we sort of started with some of the challenges that we were seeing. And one is that, the teacher pipeline is shrinking. We know that there are fewer and fewer students, unfortunately, coming through our traditional prep programs through our EPPs. A growing number of teachers are coming into the system through lateral entry and other ways. And so how could we rethink both the supports for those teachers coming into the system and then streamline the system more thoroughly? So the roundtable sort of discussed, how can we move from a compliance-based licensure system and a set of policies to a much more outcomes-focused system that promotes both student growth, effective teaching, and also helps to recruit, retain, and support, once they're in the profession, excellent teachers. obviously this is a bit of a paradigm shift. And so the group was really thinking outside of the box on what this would look like. So as I mentioned, we sort of identified priority one as being the licensure system itself. How do we need to rethink what that would look like to try and achieve those goals that we had sort of laid out? And the research that we had looked at and that SREB had pulled together for us really showed that the systems as it was set up was not leading to significant positive changes. And it was missing sort of three key pieces that some other states who had implemented what are called tiered licensure systems, where you've got maybe an initial license, sort of a full professional license, but maybe even advanced licenses beyond that, was not in place in North Carolina. That our system really relied mostly on inputs and not outputs or outcomes. There was a lack of consistent and required support mechanisms in our licensure system, particularly things like teacher mentorship, quality individualized professional development, and obviously a collaborative culture. And obviously, for those of you on this call who are doing advanced teaching roles, those are the types of things that you're putting in place in your school systems now. So those might not be missing in some of your schools, but on the whole, they're things that have either shrunk or have gone away, unfortunately, in our system. And of course, that our current system sort of neglects state-based compensation structures that would support this idea of tiered licensure and compensating teachers based on their expertise. And we know, again, this is something that a lot of our advanced teaching role schools are actually doing. So we looked across the nation to see, what was happening out there. And there are some states that are doing some innovative things, but not quite to the level I think that we thought would be necessary. And then looked at sort of what does the research tell us about all the different things that we know about both recruitment, preparation, retention, support, and licensure, and how could we sort of rethink this system to try and achieve these things. You can go on to the next slide, Leah. So what we found was, this is sort of a simplified graphic of our current licensure policy. Obviously, there's a bit of a narrow entrance to get into the profession. You have to achieve coursework, which is important, both pedagogically and content-wise, but also pass a couple of benchmarks along the way. Usually there's a couple of licensure exams, a content exam, and possibly a pedagogical assessment like the EdTPA or the PPAT. So it's a rather narrow entrance into the exam, into the profession. There's no real clear off-ramps for helping teachers who we think might not be well suited for the profession to help guide them to another profession or to another role. And then there's no consideration of teacher effectiveness for moving from an initial license to a continuing license. And this has been especially acute in some of the teachers that we know that are not able to pass some of our licensure exams. We hear anecdotally from many principals and superintendents that they have teachers who are outstanding teachers. They're meeting effectiveness benchmarks, high growth or MET growth, but they can't pass the licensure exam. And so therefore, it's a teacher that unfortunately, our current licensure policy does not recognize that they're actually a great teacher, but they can't meet that one benchmark that's in place. And so, North Carolina's data shows, as I mentioned, some of these unintended consequences that we had found earlier. And obviously, over the years, we've developed a series of patchwork or Band-Aid solutions to try and fix the problem. And that was sort of what brought this group together, was the need for one of these Band-Aid solutions to try and fix the problem. And so we started thinking about, what would this look like moving forward? You can go to the next slide. So the vision that the Roundtable came up with that we've titled the NC Pathways to Excellence for Teaching Professionals offers sort of an early, inclusive, and clear passages or pathways into the profession, but also looks to reward excellence and advancement and encourage retention along the way. So obviously the path at the beginning of the profession is much wider, as you can see from the graphic, allowing more folks into the profession, while also having ways that teachers who are not good fits for the profession, there's clear off-ramps. And then having a much more, I guess you could say, narrow or much clearer definition of what a full license would look like based on effectiveness as an educator, and eventually what will be multiple measures to demonstrate effectiveness to move into a continuing license. There's also, and you see there the associate's degree, the vision also lays out an idea of an apprenticeship or a learning permit stage, where someone who is working towards licensure and a bachelor's degree could enter the profession as an apprentice teacher, gain a year, maybe 2 or more years of experience as an apprentice under a fully licensed expert teacher, and then which will hopefully strengthen their abilities once they get full license and enter the profession as a full teacher of record. You can go on to the next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, these sort of clear exit points that would help us to guide ineffective teachers out of the profession if they're showing sort of a lack of demonstrated content or pedagogical skills, a lack of demonstrated effectiveness, or if they're not able to meet the requirements towards full licensure in time as we go. And I think, as you'll see from this vision, the idea is that there would be both the time and the supports to help those teachers get there along the way. And so if they're not able to meet that, then it gives an opportunity for our administrators and our mentor teachers to counsel and guide those individuals out of the profession. You can go on to the next slide. So this is a graphic of the vision that was developed by the Roundtable, and I first want to start with that this is really a vision. This is not a fully developed policy or a fully developed system for what it needs to be. I think there's some key areas that are sort of framework, I guess you could say, of what should be in the system. But where we are in the process now is that back in February, members of the Roundtable presented to the State Board of Education on this vision, and the State Board has tasked PEPC, the Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission, with taking this vision and really fleshing out what would the policy changes, the programmatic changes, compensation and budget changes need to be to help to achieve this vision, and what is feasible. Or not even feasible, what would be needed to get to that level. And so PEPC now has 4 subcommittees, which, as I mentioned, many of you are on, at least one, if not more, of those subcommittees. And I'll talk a little bit more about them later. But they're now digging into this vision and looking at research and other information to sort of see how can we make this vision a reality, and what's it going to take. So to start with, you'll see there sort of in the largest box, that second box around entry-level certifications, the vision here is that what we now think of as an initially licensed or beginning teacher phase would sort of fall within that framework there. And then your fully certified and then advanced teachers would be in the professional level certification and advanced credentials there on the right-hand side. And so starting off, a teacher coming into the system with a bachelor's degree would start at a minimum at license 1. And a license 1, as we've defined here, would be a teacher in residency. This, for comparison purposes, would be typically where your residency teachers, or what we used to call lateral entry teachers, would probably enter the profession. They've completed a bachelor's. They may have some or no coursework in pedagogy, but they have some content expertise in their field of teaching. So maybe you could envision, a recent bachelor's graduate with a mathematics degree coming out, and they're going to become a high school math teacher. They would enter in at license 1. And at license 1 at this level, as you can see there, they're paired with one of our advanced teachers, and they start off at a starting salary for the profession. But they also have access to, and the Roundtable thought of it as a $5,000, but again, that's not set, a stipend that would allow them to access professional development, coursework at an EPP, or other resources to help grow their skills as they progress through their entry-level certification. The next level license, a license 2, is a teacher who has demonstrated either content knowledge at the standards that have been set for the profession, which are yet to be determined. But if we think of it now, maybe they've passed the Praxis 1 or have demonstrated content knowledge in some other way, or they've demonstrated pedagogical knowledge. Maybe they've passed the EdTPA or have passed the second level Praxis, if you will, for under our current standards. And so they have demonstrated one of the 2 big sets of skills that we expect to see, but not both. And those teachers would get a slightly higher compensation. So because they've demonstrated part of those skills that we're expecting to see, they get compensated at a higher level, but they still have access to this pot of money where they can take courses, they can access professional development, and they're still paired with an advanced teacher who's guiding them along the way. Once a teacher has demonstrated both the minimum standards for content and the minimum standards of pedagogy, so I think a good way to think about this is more than likely a teacher that's coming out of a traditional EPP pathway. They've passed the EdTPA, they've passed the Praxis 1, and then any other Praxis test, and are coming in as a fully initial licensed teacher. They would be a license 3. So they've demonstrated both the minimum content and pedagogical knowledge of for the profession. Those teachers are getting an even higher rate of pay than the license 1 and license 2, but they still have access to this pot of money for professional development and advancement. And so they're given the same resource, the advanced teacher, also that access to those funds so that they can continue to grow their skills. At the bottom end of that, you see there the learning permit, and this is the apprentice teacher that I mentioned. This would be an individual who has completed at least an associate's degree and would come in and work under the supervision of a fully licensed license 4 teacher as an apprentice. The details on this, again, as with all of this, are still getting worked out by PEPC. But the idea is that this would be someone who could come in and really be getting some on-the-ground classroom experience alongside an advanced teacher while they're working towards their minimum bachelor's degree. It could be in a teaching field, or it could be in a content area, but they're essentially going to be an apprentice along the way. So the way that teachers would move between 1, 2, and 3 is they would meet those minimum standards that I mentioned and could move up that scale. You could also have an individual come in at any of those levels along the way. As I mentioned, someone who completes a traditional pathway through an EPP might come in at license 3 instead of license 1, which actually, from a compensation perspective, is more lucrative for them because they're going to come out making more money than someone who comes in through just completing a bachelor's or meeting one of the 2 sort of sets of big standards at license 2. But you could have anybody come in at any point along the way. And then teachers can move up on that license pathway over the course of time. And the way that the Roundtable envisioned this is that teachers would have 5 years once they enter the profession in this license 1, 2, or 3 pathway to meet the standards for license 4. And the idea around license 4 is that this is really where our outcomes measures come into play. So to achieve license 4, a teacher would have to demonstrate effectiveness for 3 out of 5 years to be able to achieve license 4. And once you reach license 4, you then get a pretty sizable bump in salary. So now you're at a professional level license, you're making a more professional level salary, and you're now considered or classified as an expert, fully licensed teacher. And so once you've demonstrated that 3 years out of 5 years of effectiveness as a 1, 2, or 3 licensed teacher, you move into license 4. So you could envision maybe there's a teacher that comes in with a minimum bachelor's at a license 1. They're using their stipend to get some PD, maybe taking some coursework. Maybe in their first 3 years of teaching, they demonstrate effectiveness. They could move straight into license 4 at that point because they've met the requirements of effectiveness along the way. Whether they make it to license 1 or license 2 or license 3 doesn't matter. They could jump right to license 4. The same could be for a license 2 or a license 3 teacher. Once you've demonstrated those 3 years of effectiveness, you can jump right into license 4. So this is really where that dynamic that I was talking about earlier of focusing on outcomes versus inputs really comes into play. That we're not going to be expecting teachers to meet, what we currently think of as the benchmarks along the way. But as long as you can demonstrate effectiveness, then you're going to move into that professional level license. So at that point, teachers sort of maintain that license on a renewal cycle, again, as envisioned, and these details have to be worked out on a 5-year renewal cycle as we currently have now. But teachers that want to advance beyond that would then have the ability to move into what the Roundtable thinks of as advanced teacher certification levels. So this would be really building off of the great work that you and your colleagues are doing in the advanced teaching roles districts, and creating a system at the state level that would allow for you as districts to better identify these teachers, and then hopefully the supports at the state level to also support them once you move them into that role. So the idea would be is that there would be 2 certification levels. One would be an advanced teacher of classroom excellence. And so again, there would be criteria to meet the certification, but they must have demonstrated highly effective teaching for 3 out of 5 years to be eligible for this level of certification. And this certification would really allow teachers, this would be, I think, what most of our advanced teaching roles call multi-classroom, is it multi-classroom leader? I think, or yeah, where you're serving a greater number of students than just a traditional classroom holds. Maybe I've got that wrong, Leah. I see you shaking your head. So,
sorry, extended impact is the
extended impact. Sorry,
and multi-classroom leadership is the adult leadership one.
Right.
Yep.
So this is the extended impact. So a teacher who might take on a larger class or have a greater impact, this would be that level of certification. This would also include a salary increase as it does now. But I think the key difference would be is that the teacher could be eligible for the certification from the state, but they wouldn't get the salary increase until they're hired into the position. So for instance, maybe there's a teacher in Pitt County that's eligible and they get the certification, but maybe there's not an extended impact position available in Pitt County, but there is in Greene County. So they might actually get hired to move to Greene County with that certification. That's when they would get that increased salary as an extended impact teacher. The other level of certification would be the adult leadership, or what I think many of you call multi-classroom teachers. And this is really that mentor teacher that's going to be helping to guide teachers that are in the 1, 2, or 3 or others through growing their student growth, but also growing as a teacher. And so this again would be criteria that would be 3 out of 5 years of highly effective teaching, but also some other competencies that are yet to be determined around their ability to coach and mentor adults, which I know has been what many of you and your districts have been working to figure out. How do you measure that type of competency? This would be even an increased level of pay over the other advanced teacher certification, but again, would be a certification. A teacher could earn the certification, but not yet be hired into a role. And then once they're hired into the role, that's when the salary level would kick in. I think the Roundtable's vision is that there would be some level of state support for that advanced salary. Again, these details have to be worked out. That could obviously be supplemented by local supports or by other efforts at your local level, but that this system would include some level of funding from the state to help support that. I'm going to stop there because that was a lot and see if you have any questions before I move on to sort of where things are with the process that we're in. And obviously, Brenda, Joanna, Tom, and anybody else that's on the Pepsi subcommittees, feel free to jump in and share any other information that would be helpful.
So Geoff, this is Guy Hill. So this
Okay.
model that the governor's office wants the state to follow, correct?
So good question. So this is really a model that's been developed, a vision that's been developed collaboratively by a bunch of stakeholders. So I wouldn't say that this is the governor's proposal. We've obviously, myself and the governor's former teacher advisor, Latanya Patillo, were involved in the creation of this. And I think we're supportive of these ideas, but I wouldn't say this is the governor's proposal, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you.
Absolutely.
It was presented to the state board, and they have sort of endorsed it, right, as
That's
a
correct.
concept. So it's in terms of sort of where the ball is right now. I think, Guy, to your question, it was presented to the state board as kind of as a concept, again, not fully baked, but as a concept. And since they've sent it over to Pepsi, who's working with the subcommittees on it. So with the idea that it sort of has well, I don't want to say full-throated endorsement, but I think it is. I think they specifically said, we really like this. Let's see how we can flesh it out and bring in more stakeholders.
Absolutely.
Follow-up question. So
go ahead.
If the state would the state board approve this, and if so, when do you think they would vote on it?
Great question. So sort of the timeline, and I think, Leah, if you want to go to the next slide, I think there's a little bit of details on this. So the for this vision to be formalized would require changes legislatively and state board policy in the budget in a range of areas. So the state board couldn't do this unilaterally. But I think that the buy-in, the support, the approval, if you will, of the state board is going to be sort of key to moving this forward, I think, as Brenda said. And so where we are in the process is the board has tasked Pepsi with really creating, fleshing out this framework even more, figuring out what should we be thinking about for all those criteria for the content and the pedagogy, the license 2 and license 3 areas. How are we going to measure effectiveness for every teacher, which we currently do not have mechanisms for doing that? And then what are some of the other policy pieces we need to be thinking about? How will teachers demonstrate competencies along those continuums, particularly for the advanced roles? What are those going to look like? What should the compensation and budget structure look like? So there's a lot of different moving parts to this, but Pepsi's created 4 subcommittees, one around preparation and entry, one around licensure, one around advancement and development, and one around budget and compensation. There's a lot of overlap in those areas, and I think Pepsi is really doing a good job of trying to make sure that there's cross communication of issues. But the idea is that by I guess early next year, so 2022, that ideally Pepsi will have figured out some of these key components and will have a proposal to bring back to the board for then the board's feedback, and then possibly presenting to the General Assembly after that. This process is really designed to both refine the proposal, figure out what are those thorny policy questions we need to get resolved and things we would need to change to achieve this, and then to get stakeholder feedback. The Pepsi subcommittees have a mix of Pepsi members, members from the Roundtable, but also a much larger group of stakeholders from school districts and HR administrators in school districts, teachers, principals, superintendents. Our EPPs are represented as well. So a large group of stakeholders are engaged in these conversations. So that's sort of where we are in the process. I think timeline-wise, by early, first quarter of next year would be the vision for when, if if we can figure out all these thorny questions, that would be the vision of when this would come back to the state board for their feedback, approval. But again, it would require a number of policy changes at the board level as well as legislative changes to fully achieve this vision.
Hi, this is Cheryl Wilson from Wilson County Schools, and we are in the planning stages for opportunity culture. When will you be getting some information from the school districts that are implementing right now as a part of your program?
That's a great question. And Tom or Brenda, I know that there are some, I think, advanced teaching roles districts that are represented on the Pepsi subcommittee, but I'll defer to you guys on who and sort of how that's feeding into the process.
Yeah, Cheryl, Tom, please.
So Cheryl, just to clarify your question, when you say get information from the districts, do you mean outcomes of these programs in terms of their efficacy, or?
I think that would be great, but I also think about some of the hurdles that we are facing, particularly our class size waiver. We have a lot of questions, schools that are interested, schools that are not interested because of the limited information around the class size waiver, as well as the O1 conversion of positions for core stipends. So those are two that we have found as huge hurdles in trying to get our other schools on board. We have lots of schools that are very much interested in this and believe in what you've shared today. But those are two that we need to get taken care of legislatively.
So glad you brought those up, Cheryl.
Yeah.
Tom and his team did a great job yesterday. That's part of the chitter chatter at the beginning of the conversation. We had 4 presenters, 2 of which are doing advanced roles, and one was the public impact folks. And they brought that up several times. So definitely that message is getting through in these conversations, as are all of the other ones, right? The importance of training, the importance of consistency, the importance of knowing that this is something you can count on 5 years from now instead of just today. So sustainability. So all of that is coming through. I would also encourage each and every single one of you, these are public meetings and they are recorded. So even if you can't attend them, if you want to engage, these are absolutely open to the public. And I know that speaking for myself, but hearing from the subcommittee chairs, they want as many people to be involved as possible. Your voices, those of you who are on the ground doing this work, are the most important in this, because you're the early adopters. The next generation of districts that are going to start moving into this work are going to be the folks who kind of want it sort of pre-packaged and settled, right? So we're the ones who have to kind of figure out all these complicated issues and bring them to the forefront and get them resolved. And lastly, I'll point out that to those 2 specific questions, Leah is going to be addressing those and where those stand, and so because that's something that's the top of our advocacy agenda, are those 2 flexibilities you're talking about. So we'll be talking about those in a second. But please, I do encourage each and every one of you to log on to these subcommittees and start following them, because this is the evolution of where we get to bring this statewide and have sustainability for this work.
Geoff,
I'm pretty sure that sorry, go ahead, Tom.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure I clarified for Cheryl that what you're seeing here in relation to the Human Capital Roundtable vision is not a solution to your immediate problem. And we can help you with those immediate problems. Robert Sachs is our dedicated person on the advanced teaching roles. And I'm certainly here to assist you in terms of the flexibility around class size waivers and how we can assist with that. We can also connect you with folks in finance who can work with you on those conversions, excuse me. So please reach out to us. Are you the program lead for Wilson County?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so if you want to connect with us, separate from this, but I didn't want you to get the impression that Human Capital Roundtable is going to solve these problems, because we got to get you up and running quicker than that.
Yes.
Geoff, this is Seth Brown, Pitt County.
I
when
said,
when Cheryl was just asking about feedback from districts, I think that's something that's going to be vitally important because I've talked with different people. In fact, Jill Kamenetz is on that committee from Pitt and was a school board member. And I can tell you when I saw it this time, because I've seen that diagram on the last slide before, I've seen it before and it looked like it made sense. It looked like it aligned to positions we have in Pitt. I can also tell you that we have a slightly different model than the opportunity culture model. And the way you outlined it, there are a couple of concerns that really need to be addressed, or point blank, we're going to be left out. And so I think it's just one of those things of getting feedback of every district that has advanced teaching roles, giving us this model and letting us make it real. I think is going to greatly inform what you guys do, so we don't create something that's very narrow and leave some other innovative ideas on the outside. Would be one thing that just got my attention there. I'll tell you the other thing too, just real quick while I've got the floor, is looking at the highly effective teaching instruction. My guess is that's a deal with SAS, and we have to move from a 3-year average to somehow getting 5 years worth of data, because that's something that we're looking at even as we are requalifying right now outside of the grant. And so we're looking at what data do we have access to. And when I saw 3 instructions 3 out of 5 years, basically, I'm like, all right, we got to have data for that, because otherwise historically we can't find out who's even eligible. So those are some of those fine-tuning feedback pieces that might be helpful, because we're right here in the weeds of qualifying people. That's just up on my radar. So I think those 2 things would be something that I would appreciate personally, just really looking at taking this model and what does it look like in a real district doing this work.
absolutely. Those are great points, Seth, and thank you. And I know, Tom's going to mention something, but I know Kim Evans is also on the call, who's coordinating and leading a lot of the Pepsi work. So I think that's good feedback from her, because particularly those advanced teacher certifications, those of you guys who have been leading on this work, we're going to have to learn how to measure that from you guys, because you're the ones who have laid this groundwork. So Tom, go ahead.
So I just want to respond to the advanced roles issue that Seth raised. I don't want to speak for you, Geoff, but the way I interpreted what you said was, here's something to help you contextualize what we're talking about with these roles. This is not an indication that we are adopting the opportunity culture model or anything like. We love opportunity culture, but we're not. These would be roles the district could define based on their context and their needs, and it is not going to be a you have to do it this way type role. So I'm glad you raised that, because we certainly don't want to communicate that message. And then Seth, I would encourage you, I know you I don't think you intended it to be as narrow as what you suggested, but many people look at this and when they see effectiveness, they automatically assume EVOS. We are committed to expanding the notion of effectiveness beyond what is EVOS. We think EVOS is a great tool, and it definitely has a place in this model. But as many of you will quickly recognize, this whole model can't run off EVOS and be a pathway for all teachers. And so the Human Capital Roundtable is committed to expanding that notion of what it means to be an effective teacher, to incorporate all teachers. So that's.
Thank you, Tom. And I think to piggyback on what Tom said around at least the 2 advanced teacher certification levels that the Roundtable envisioned, and I might be speaking more for myself, but this is how I've envisioned it, and trying to put it in a framework that might make sense, is that currently I think we've got certification. So not licensed, you got to be a licensed teacher, but then to be a teacher in an AIG program, you've got to get an AIG certification, or to be an ESL teacher, you have to be an ESL certification. So that is what these advanced teacher certifications would be. It's a minimum. It's not what would be expected to be able to be hired into that role. It's a sort of a state level minimum. And it very well might be that, similar to a gifted position or an ESL position in your districts, there might be requirements beyond that level of certification that would be required. Or maybe even you have a position that you would want teachers to have both of those certifications. So I don't think it's meant to streamline what the positions would look like, but it's meant to recognize at least 2 of the big buckets of competencies that we know that you as leaders in this work sort of rely on, that highly effectiveness teaching and the adult leadership, and sort of the certifications or the demonstration of those competencies, so that you know that this individual's met these minimum requirements, if that makes sense. And I think Robert Smith, did you have a question?
I did. Thanks, Robert Smith from UNC Wilmington. I work preparing high school teachers. I've been doing this for many years, and I'm overall delighted to see this model, and praise for all of you who've put time into creating this much more detailed plan for teachers as they enter the profession. And I think what it highlights is teaching as a profession, and that has been one of the challenges in North Carolina, that oftentimes teaching has not been valued as a profession. So I think what you've developed here really reinforces that, the sort of career pathway approach. So good work. One thing I wanted to suggest, as I look at the model, and I've heard quite a number of people use the word innovation. And so my question, if what we're looking here is the development of leadership in schools, is there a place where we would see that part of that leadership is in support of innovation? And so would this be in terms of the advanced licensure? Would this be in terms of the person, and this would be the multi-classroom teacher? Would this come in relation to their mentoring? It does seem to me, and particularly given what we've just been through in COVID and the major changes that schools were forced to make, and going, you know, the obvious one, going from fully face-to-face to overnight virtually, what we see coming out of that are some examples of innovative practices. And so how does this model value innovation as against value what we've traditionally been doing in classrooms, which is good, but we need to, I think, in education, embrace the importance of innovation. And so my question is there a way in which this leadership model could be accommodate innovation or support innovation in a way that I think I've heard many of us say that is something, as we're looking to the future of the profession of public schools, that we would want to have that as an important built into what we're designing and what we're creating. And so again, I'm very supportive of what you put together, but this would be one thing, the importance of innovation, and how are we fostering, how are we supporting, how are we rewarding, how are we developing, encouraging people to think creatively about the work in classrooms and the work in schools, which I think is, in terms of putting North Carolina sort of at the forefront in terms of a public education system, is very consistent with what's being proposed here. But I think it's another piece that I would like to see embraced by this model.
Robert, I'm so glad you brought that up, and I'm in a moment going to hand it to Stephanie to help answer that, because the one thing we found coming out of COVID is that whether it's advanced teaching roles or other distributed leadership models, schools that had distributed leadership were able to adjust faster, right? So innovation, whether it's because of a pandemic or it's because we need to do better on the science of reading, it gets distributed better through this model. And Stephanie, you guys have done some really good research. I know Ed Council and others have done some good research on this. Could you add just a little bit of color to that anecdote?
Sure. I think what Brenda's saying is exactly what I would say. It's a distributed leadership model that's being put into place, but the schools and the districts can use that model to drive whatever change it is that they need to see or are hoping to make in their schools. So it's flexible in that sense. It's not a program, but more of a structure. And it is meaning to change the way of business, the way of instructional business in schools, the way that happens. So we have seen good outcomes in our opportunity culture schools. We've seen the average performance of teachers go up pretty significantly in reading and in math when they're operating on a multi-classroom leaders team, because they're getting a lot of support, they're getting a lot of guidance in a way that they never have before. So it really does change the way of instruction happening in schools in that regard, but it's not applying any certain model. It's allowing schools to choose that model. So flexible in that regard. I do think, Robert, one thing I would add to the list that you mentioned that you would like to see, I think learning from folks who are doing this work is also really important. So thinking about how we have lots of districts now who have stepped up and are innovating in this way and putting these models into place. How are we gathering up lessons learned from their experience? I think Cheryl was getting to that a little bit. Maybe Seth as well. How are we learning about the characteristics of the different roles and ways this is being implemented? And what do we know is really powerful? And what do we know hasn't worked so well? So we can guide others as they try to put the models into place.
And I would piggyback on that, Stephanie, to see what is it that we're learning from those teacher leaders that are really good mentors, because I think that's where innovation really takes hold, is whenever a teacher innovates and then can share it with their colleagues, then it starts to spread, right? And so how do we learn, what is it about those teacher leaders that is so powerful that we can help them to help other mentors to learn the same skills?
And Margaret, I'll answer your question in the chat. Margaret Turlington is asking about how this relates to NC Stride. For those of you who are not familiar with NC Stride, that teacher recruitment action plan just came out, and I'm going to put in the chat the link to it so you can download a copy. How does this relate? Well, as we talk about teacher recruitment, we recognize that the experience of being a teacher is a very, very important recruitment tool, right? So they have to know that they're coming into a profession where in their first year, they're not getting the hardest classroom in the building, where their principal doesn't have 50 direct reports, where they get to have this professional growth. And so actually it's also linked to for those of you who are involved with Fit Leaders, First in Teaching, right? All of these things are connected, right? This is about a profession, and sometimes we have to, in the case of NC Stride, it's really just looking at teacher recruitment, but we do it within the frame of recognizing that the profession itself has to be something that people want to go into, and that when they're getting into the profession, it's a place where they're welcome. So I hope that answers your question. But these are all interrelated, and at some point we sometimes have to slice them up and look at parts and pieces to get deep and go into those individual pieces, but we do need to keep pulling back and recognizing that it's all connected.